Hi, good afternoon, all. I'm Felicia Marcus, Landreth Visiting Fellow at Water in the West, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar in our new webinar series covering water in the West. I'll not be your moderator today, but I have the honor of introducing our panelists so that I can introduce our moderator, who's an accomplished journalist in her own right. We wanted to host this discussion because water is a challenging beat to cover and a challenging policy issue to work on, in part because it's so complex on so many levels. As policymakers or as academics or as any other kind of expert or as an interested person, we struggle with seeing the context of California or Western water issue as a whole and how to place our work within it and what to work on. Journalists have to do this well, and they have crazy short deadlines. We chose journalists who not only cover water, they cover it exceptionally well. They know how to dig deep and somehow make sense of it to the rest of us by illuminating the details of a story and by being able to place that story in a historical or political or current context to make it sing, or at least be intelligible. Thank you for joining us for this conversation on how to make that happen. Your moderator today will be Felicity Barringer Taubman. Felicity is the writer in residence at Stanford's Bill Lane Center for the American West. She is editor and lead writer for the centers and in the West and the West blog on Western environmental and health issues. Prior to Stanford, Barringer was a reporter for the New York Times for 28 years, the last decade of which was spent as an environmental correspondent. She provided an in-depth look at the adoption of California's landmark climate change legislation, an issue that certainly rivals, if not surpasses, water in California. Recently, she's focused on the West's water challenges. And prior to the New York Times, she spent 9 years as a reporter for the Washington Post. She'll be joined by Ian James, Lois Henry, and Abram Lustgarten. Ian James is a reporter for the LA Times, focused on water in California and the West. Before joining the Los Angeles Times in 2021, he was an environment reporter at the Arizona Republic and the Desert Sun. And before that, he was bureau chief in Venezuela for the Associated Press for 8 years. His work has examined overexploitation of water by large corporate farms in Arizona, groundwater depletion in farming areas around the world, and extensive coverage of how climate change is affecting the Southwest and the Colorado River in particular. He's now added the Delta and a range of other issues to his impressive repertoire, much to the relief of many of us, and I hope not to his regret. Lois Henry, born and raised in Fresno, California, has spent 30 years reporting on issues in the San Joaquin Valley, covering the complicated areas of water rights, contracts, and lawsuits, which is quite a specialty. Much of her career was spent at the Bakersfield Californian as a reporter, as a columnist whose columns we waited for with bated breath, and as an editor covering natural resource issues in county and state government. She is now CEO and editor of San Joaquin Valley Water, an independent nonprofit news site dedicated to covering water in the San Joaquin Valley, which is the go-to site for covering the intricacies of groundwater management, in particular the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, fights over surface water, and just plain interesting stuff. Abram Lustgarten, last but certainly not least, is an environmental and investigative reporter with ProPublica, focused on the intersection of business, climate, and energy. His series, Killing the Colorado, about the causes of water scarcity in the American West, was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. He co-produced a documentary with the same name for the Discovery Channel, which, by the way, was quite beautiful and educational. Recently, his work is focused on climate change is pushing human migration, including for Americans, as well as refugees moving across international borders. His creativity, coupled with his capacity for detail, give unparalleled depth to his coverage. I could say far more about this impressive set of what I consider to be true public servants, who were all masters of... Sorry, Siri thought I was talking to her. They're all masters of making the complex intelligible and interesting, but I'm going to turn it to Felicity to get the conversation started. Thanks so much for letting me join you. Enjoy the day.
Thank you, Felicia. That was lovely to have you, with all your policy background, bring us together. And I'm so glad that the Water in the West program has roped you into their lives. The Water in the West program at Stanford is hosting our event. It's a joint program of the Woods Institute for the Environment and the Bill Lane Center for the American West. It focuses on the West's growing water scarcity problem and attempts to bridge the gap between academic research and applied solutions to inform policymakers, water managers, businesses, environmental groups, and all of us reporters who really need help covering this. So I'm going to start the questions now. And I have a question that I'd like to ask everyone. Ian, I'm going to ask you to start off on this, but Lois and Abram, please join in, either wait till Ian's done or just interrupt along the way. It's a basic question about the beat we've all covered. I've covered other beats in my life that they've involved politics or international affairs. And by and large, I thought my audience had a clear understanding of the framework of what I was writing about. Covering water is more like covering cybersecurity. The technological and legal frameworks are complicated and totally counterintuitive sometimes. So which of these four concepts are the hardest to explain and why? Priority water rights and beneficial use, the Colorado River Compact, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, known to its friends as SGMA, and adjudication of basins. Ian, you've covered everything. Which of these is hardest to write about?
I think they're all complicated, and but I would say probably first on that list for me would be the water rights system and prior appropriation and how it ended up this way. And certainly I look to experts to help me understand these things, but it is notable that there are more water rights out there on paper than there is real water that's available. And increasingly that's more and more of a problem. So I think that's one area that I find especially challenging in terms of the history and the intricacies of explaining it.
Lois, what about you?
Yeah, I guess I would agree that water rights is one of those things that it permeates everything, and it also sort of lords over so many different things and reasons for why things can and can't happen, and yet you have to go back to square one and explain it, and it takes, in terms of print, it takes so much space and time to explain things so that people just have the basic ground level understanding of, oh, okay, this is now that, because you usually are trying to talk about a new law or a rule or curtailment or something like that. And you have to spend all this time sort of building that base of the pyramid so you can just give that one little new nugget of information. And as far as SGMA, I hesitate to use the word simple, but in comparison with rights, like river rights, SGMA is what it is. The law, you can go back and you can look at it and you can reread it and you can ask for interpretations of it and stuff, but it is what it is. And everybody's sort of still struggling to get around to it. And that's what I spend the majority of my time writing about. So maybe it just seems simpler to me. And I think I've told you before, the Colorado River just seems to me like, I never want to touch that one. That is like going back to master's school or something. Good on you, Abram. It's all yours. So that's kind of my view of the world. I kind of feel that way about the Delta too, but I can't avoid the Delta.
Abram, over to you.
Well, I'm going to go with adjudication for 500. I think, and I can't really explain it. I mean, I think this is the California reporters, purview, but it's difficult because it's arguing over all the other things that we have a difficult time describing and quantifying, including water rights and water usage. So it's sort of, to me, it's the top of the pyramid of complexity. But I think, the water rights, there's something sort of on its simplest level that we all kind of connect with, and it's at the heart of the whole, sort of shortage and scarcity issues that we'll be talking about. And it's this idea, that it basically goes to the first people to arrive here, the first to claim it, and there's so many layers of complexity above, beyond that. But that basic idea, gets at much of the competition for for the resources, whether it's in Colorado or California now today, and much of the arguments over who should get it as our population grows and cities expand and new people arrive, and every aspect about how it's governed in the future. So water rights is my favorite to talk about.
And let me ask you, since you're the one who's written most about the Colorado, what about the Colorado River Compact and the subsequent adjustments to that compact? I mean, that takes, as Lois talked about, taking a lot of space. That's got to take a lot of space in all your Colorado stories.
Yeah, I mean, so many things about the Colorado River, watershed are fascinating and absurd. Starting at that 40,000 foot level, the Colorado River Compact, this agreement between the 7 states and Mexico that essentially oversubscribed the river, overestimated the amount of water to be divided up between these states, and then has never really been substantially corrected in the almost a century since that oversubscription has become well understood. So that has just baffled me, in all the time I've been reporting on this issue. But then you get to a really sort of granular, the micro level, and those water rights again get so complicated on a state level and on an individual property level, where you're trying to quantify not just sort of how much an uphill ranch might use from their water rights, but how much of that percolates down into the soil and then goes into the soil of their neighboring water holder, and how you try to account for those two things. That's maybe not unique to the Colorado Basin, but has really kind of blown my mind in the 6 or 8 years that I've been looking at this.
So Ian, I'm coming back to you for a second. I'm in part because there are 2 major water stories. Well, there are a million major water stories in the West, but they come in 2 buckets. One is a Colorado River bucket, and for me, the other is a California bucket, which has a bunch of sub buckets. You've worked for the Desert Sun, you've worked for the Arizona Republic, and now you're working for the Los Angeles Times. So you've done both Colorado stories and the Central Valley stories. Talking about water means talking about drought. And talking about climate. What's the difference about covering stories on the impact of drought and climate in the Colorado Basin versus in California? Is there a real difference?
Yeah, I think there is a big difference, and I am very much, I'll be the first to say that I am very much a novice in the Delta and have a lot to learn in that area. So I welcome tips to understand the basics there, but I'm doing a lot of homework. So I think the complexities of the Delta and the history of how it was developed and how it's turned out is so central to how water is used in the San Joaquin Valley, for instance, that adds some additional complexity there in terms of in those years when there's less water available from the Delta and other surface sources, the pressures on the groundwater just increase, and we all know in those areas how rapidly the water is declining. And so there are some similarities, of course, with the Colorado River Basin, and in some areas like Phoenix, for instance, if we look at how with the construction of the Central Arizona project, when that imported water came in, there were regulations placed on groundwater so that pumping and well drilling was controlled. And so I think the difference as we compare those 2 different areas is that in Phoenix, there were some controls, and Central Arizona, there were some controls placed on the use of groundwater as a condition to get that surface water, whereas in the San Joaquin Valley and in agricultural areas, that was not the case. So I find those local differences interesting and important to try to explain as part of the coverage.
Then I would like to go to Lois, if I could. Lois, many reporters go into a project, a story, with an idea of what they're likely to find. I found when I was covering water, I was often surprised. what stories have surprised you most? And what stories were the surprises really terrifying or shocking? And what stories were the most fun?
I'm going to start with the story that was the most fun, because I thought it was going to be the worst experience of my life. And that was that there was water being banked in in Kern County that was being used on paper to grow what some people in Fresno and Madera counties considered this massive sprawling subdivision. And I thought, how the heck does that work? And I just started pulling, like contract after contract after contract, because there was this layers of contracts, and they were using the Friant-Kern Canal, which is governed by the Bureau of Reclamation under the Central Valley Project, to move this water in all of these ways. It was so fascinating. I became just like fascinated by it, and I ended up making a little graphic, to show people how this all worked and stuff. And so, and it got huge play. I mean, I wrote it as a column at the Bakersfield Californian, but it got huge play, of course, in Fresno and Madera and all over. And I got all these. I somehow got somebody sent me an email string from the Bureau of Reclamation where the employees were asking each other, can this really happen? How is this happening? What wait a minute, how does this work? So that was kind of both, I guess, the most fun and surprising thing, because I thought, how can you bank water in Kern County, basically just right outside of Shafter, and use it to fill the taps of Madera subdivision? But anyway, so I guess it's always surprising to me. I'm working on a story right now about the Westlands contract that the news was that, it came out last week about a judge's ruling on it. And I was just sort of dinking around talking to some of my sources, and there's more of a story there than I thought, and so I was like, okay. So I'm kind of constantly surprised. Like you said, Felicity, it's like, you think you're going to figure something out and know it. And then you talk to like 2 or 3 experts and you're like, well, I know nothing about this. Okay, start from the beginning. So it is a fascinating kind of a, I don't know, OCD weird kind of beat, I guess, because I've covered aerospace, I covered city government, county government, I covered, cops and stuff like that. And this is just constantly like, wait, what?
So Avram, I'm going to turn the same question to you. And ask it just in a different order. What story was the most shocking or terrifying? What was the most surprising, and what was the most fun?
I mean, my answers to that question are the stories that I've written, and they're the same stories, that I've been focusing on, from the beginning since 2015. I mean, the core things that I found about the Colorado River Basin and water in the West that really were mind-blowing was that despite all of this scarcity and the contentious issue about conserving water, that there's structures in the law that encourage people to use more than they need, this sort of use it or lose it phenomenon, which is, I think especially prevalent in the Colorado River Basin, just to preserve your water rights. So, you have individuals, counties, states, the whole basin sort of acting against its own best interest. On the agricultural level, which is just such an enormously complex issue, but that you still have vastly disproportionate amounts of water being used to grow crops that are extremely inefficient, in the desert, that use enormous amounts of water. And not only does that practice continue, when I was going to cotton farms, in southern Arizona, or looking at alfalfa production in southern Arizona and southern California, but then you have the U.S. federal government, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, continuing to subsidize that kind of farming at the same time that other branches of the federal government are trying to encourage that. That water conservation and reconsideration of that use. So we're really, we're paying taxpayer dollars to have this sort of inefficient water use continue. And then the third thing, which has been remedied a bit in the years since I've been reporting, since 2015, but is this interconnection between groundwater and surface water. That traditionally, across the West, these two things have been regulated to the extent they've been regulated at all. They've been regulated, and apportioned as if they're separate, and they're not separate. And depending on the places, that we're talking about, and it varies a lot from geography to geography, but they're completely interchangeable. And you draw from a river and you pull out of groundwater, and you put a well down and you suck water out of the river. And to say that you're going to control and apportion very specific allotments of water to individual right holders, and then ignore the way that you're stealing from each other through that geological system has been pretty surprising to me from the beginning.
That's amazing. Ian, you did a lot of stories about water bottling and the privatization of water when you were with the Desert Sun. What tools did you learn in doing those stories that have you been able to use for future stories and about privatization? And what aspects of privatization have had the greatest impact on water users everywhere?
I don't know that I have a lot of insights about particular tools that I learned. I was just basically, listening to people who lived in that area and who were concerned about what was going on. And the reporting basically just went from there, and looking at documents and the records about how much water Nestle was taking, and now this other company that's taken over for Nestle, it still continues. I think one thing that I learned out of reporting that story was that the state water board has essentially told Nestle, and now this new company that's taken over for them, that they should stop taking the water, or at least a large portion of it. But it continues to be argued over. So I think one of the aspects of that case that I think applies to a lot of these water disputes is that they can really go on for a long time. But as for privatization of water supplies, I think that was your main question.
Yeah.
There is quite a bit of marketing of water, or attempts to do so, to loosen the rules to move water from one place to another. And that's happening in Arizona. We've reported on that at the Arizona Republic with a company that has been buying farmland and seeking to move that water to urban areas. And it seems like there will be more pressures to do that, especially as the scarcity worsens in the Colorado River Basin. Does that answer your question? I also was hoping to answer your other question, which I liked.
Well, I wanted to move to Lois for just a second. Lois, with all the work you've done at the Californian for all the years, you have the most knowledge of any reporter I know of what groundwater overdrafting has done in terms of depleting people's wells, particularly in poor communities, and leaving them without water, or making whole towns subside. You had a front page story in the Times on that fairly recently, in the New York Times. So has anything changed the story about overpumping and what it does, or does it just keep happening? And whose responsibility is it to make it stop?
Yeah, it just keeps happening. I was talking to a farmer up in Hanford the other day, and I had to have him repeat it. He said that one of his wells had dropped 120 feet since the beginning of this year. And I was like, that can't be true, but that's what he said. And, I don't know. So it is continuing to happen. And I was recently on a panel with somebody, and somebody was asking me, what if we have another really dry year next year? And my view was, at some point, they've got to start taking out crops or fallowing land. If we have another dry year like we did this year, next year, they just cannot sustain it, because if we have another 5% allocation and our reservoirs don't have any carryover, what's going to happen? You just can't continue to sustain without the surface water. And another person on the panel was with the Farm Bureau and said, no, we'll just go to groundwater. We have enough groundwater. And I thought, we've already got in Kern County, we've got with the 200,000 acre foot overdraft already going into Sigma. I'd done the story in 2019 where the Kern Groundwater Authority, which encompasses the majority of the basin down here, actually the executive director was taking the water managers to task, saying that the numbers that they were getting were just unbelievable because it showed a 20,000 acre foot overdraft. And it turns out it was more along the lines of, over 100,000 acre feet. And that was, prior to this drought. So it's going to be really interesting to see. You ask, like what's going to make it stop or what's going to make it change. If the view of the pumpers is what I heard the other night, that we'll just go to groundwater and we've got enough and we can manage our resources, then we're going to be in a world of hurt if we have another dry year like this. But
who should take responsibility for making it change?
Well, obviously the pumpers, people who are pumping, are gonna have to be held to account, and they're gonna, you've seen, and unfortunately Sigma has a 20-year, timeline
leading
that can be, implemented. But you're starting to see some GSAs say, look, these are the allocations, and you're going to have to pay a fine or a fee if you go over the allocations. Madera County, which has a lot of areas that are outside of district lands, and that's known as the white areas, not to be too wonky about it. But anyway, they're implementing a pretty strict fee and allocation amount. And so, but I don't know. Ultimately, I kind of think that there's going to be lawsuits and adjudication. So Abram can, come and help us sort all of that out, because there's so much at stake. There's so much money involved that and water is power and water is money. I just don't see anybody giving it up easy.
Abram,
not a bad answer.
No, that's great. Thank you. Abram, since she was talking to you, let me go back to you and the big Colorado River stories you started doing in 2015. You've done enough and had enough questions and dealt with enough complexity to have wondered where some data was. What's the biggest data the missing data that you craved when you were doing your stories over the last 5 years, your Colorado stories? What would you like there to be data on that there isn't?
Who has water rights and how much water they use? Sort of. I mean, there's the most basic things you want to know about how water is used in the West. And I know that the water rights are documented and available to different degrees, in different districts and different places. So they're not uniformly unavailable, but to look across the West and and to try to sort of wrap your head around these challenges and find a fair solution and reform the systems of the last century or more, it's pretty hard to do without some consistent sort of measure of those two basic things. And in California, for example, I'm not expert in it, ask, your California experts, but I think you have to go and chase down, paper files, in a file cabinet in Sacramento to figure out, exactly, who's using what or who has the right to take what and how far back that history goes. And if you want to bring, Nevada into the mix or Wyoming into the mix with, even sort of less sophisticated systems for accounting, your problem gets epically more complex, and that brings in another complicating factor, which is the private businesses and consulting firms that are then trying to create or make this data available or use it for their own purposes or for water trading schemes and so forth. But I think there really just needs to be a lot more transparency and a lot more of a uniform approach to to measuring and accounting for water.
So, Ian, just going back to you a second, we've talked about drought, but drought is a nice, quick word to say things are dry. It actually, when you're a reporter covering drought, it's a continuum of deficits, a little drought, a big drought, an exceptional drought. How hard is it to explain the stages of drought? And how hard is it to explain three things? One, the stages of drought. Two, what extreme droughts mean. And three, a drought's different impact in different geographies, Southern California versus the Delta, say.
Well, I think that is not necessarily a really complicated thing to explain in terms of the severity of the drought. But can you tell me a little bit more? I'm not sure I fully grasped the question.
Okay, but how hard is it to explain what the difference between a drought and what we went through last year, and if Lois's worries are come true, and what we may go through next year or the year after? One thing, when you're covering things for a general audience, you can say there's a drought and they know it's dry. What we had this past year wasn't just it's dry. How do you explain the difference between a word that means it's dry and a word that means everything's going to hell?
Well, it seems like we're talking about aridification and the gradual drying of the West, that there are cycles, there will continue to be cycles. California has always been highly variable. So, those long droughts will continue to come back, and those wet flooding periods will continue to come back, but that's happening against that backdrop, as the IPCC report described it, of a water cycle that is being intensified. And so those drought periods are getting more intense, they're getting longer, and they're just hot droughts. So that, I've heard some of the water managers describe it as basically we're in the second year of a drought, but if it had been a decade or two ago, it's more like what would have been seen in the fifth year of a drought in terms of the conditions on the ground and the really dry soil moisture levels, which all contribute back to it. And so it seems like, although there's that cyclical drought that will continue to come and go, that we're moving toward a period of needing to adapt to just less water overall in the long run. And as for the regional differences, I mean, we're seeing it on display this year with some of the areas in Northern California where it's just been so severe, and they've been needing to talk about the idea of the pipeline to Marin County, for instance.
Yeah.
But was there anything else you wanted me to talk about there?
No, that's it's the different geographies, I guess. It is hot in Los Angeles. It's as hot or hotter than it is in some other places, but they didn't have as much trouble with water distribution. Is that because the agency has been really efficient over the years at saving water, or is that what's the difference between the way the drought impacted Los Angeles and San Diego, which wasn't that dramatic, and the way it impacted people up on the Klamath?
I think it's the amount of storage that they had invested in, so that they were able to store more water just north of the Los Angeles area. And of course, San Diego, having invested in both desalination and water imports from the Imperial Valley, they have some of the country's most expensive water, but they've also bought themselves a bit better of a situation. So I think part of it has to do with stored water and infrastructure and preparedness. Of course, all of Southern California continues to depend to a large degree on imported water. And so I'm really interested in looking more at the move toward more water recycling and more local water supplies and cleaning up those local water supplies so that Southern California can be more locally reliant and more resilient in the long run.
Okay, Lois, I'm going to ask this question of everybody, but you get it first. And I hope it'll be a little more fun and less complex. Who are your heroes in the water world? Who of people you've run across who you think, damn, that's a hell of a thing they're doing? And what characteristics do the villains in your water world share?
I think that there is a farmer. I think I mentioned him before when we were talking. His family owns land along the San Joaquin River up by Sac Dam, which is in the Los Banos area, sort of. And the San Joaquin River Restoration Program needed a sliver of land up there to build a fish passage screen for the salmon that they're trying to reintroduce and get around this. There's the Sac Dam, and then there's the Mendota Pool, which are the two big physical impediments to salmon coming back up the river to reintroduce that species. And we did a story on it. This farm family decided to donate this land. It's like 8 acres, it's not like a massive amount of acreage, but it was a huge jump forward for the San Joaquin River Restoration Program. So it was just a great little donation. It, didn't take a lot out of the farmer's hide. I don't think he had it even really planted and anything. But interestingly, there was a reclamation district nearby that had been trying to prevent that. And these guys they all know each other, they all work together, et cetera, et cetera. And there was some speculation that the reclamation district, which has ties to some of the districts that aren't really in favor of the San Joaquin Restoration Program, that maybe they were trying to prevent that because they were trying to condemn the land and get it themselves. For what purpose is, kind of a mystery. But anyway, so kind of in the face of all of that, this farmer decided to go ahead and do that, and did it for the fish and for the future of the program. So I mean, that's kind of heroic in a way, I would think. And to me, as a reporter, water beat, non-water beat, what I really hate and what all villains seem to share is not outright lying, but just not giving you the full picture when you ask a question of them. And I hate that. that is a trait that I see a lot and over my career. And believe me, I remember your name when I figure it out.
Ian, I'll ask you the same too. Your heroes and the characteristics of the villains you encounter.
Yeah, I think I've run into a lot of people who are doing heroic work on water access and helping get water to people who either have contaminated water, hazardous chemicals in their water, or natural contaminants, or people who are dealing with a dry well. And so some of those people are paid, they're working for organizations that are doing this type of work, and also recently met someone named Larry Holliday, who was on his own time just delivering water to people in the Navajo Nation in the Monument Valley area. And I thought that was really heroic. And someone else who stands out is Michael Bogan, who I recently met with. He's an ecologist at the University of Arizona, and he has been day in and day out studying the renewal of the Santa Cruz River in Tucson and documenting the dragonflies and all the life that's coming back because they're putting recycled water into the river, and they're seeing a real renewal there. And as for villains, I see, I'm interested in investigating mismanagement of water supplies. And so I think there are a lot of cases out there.
Abram, start with villains with you.
Oh, start with villains. Well,
start
I'm not
with
gonna,
villains.
The villains are usually, and I think also in this case, the special interests and people that are out there to make money off of, in this case, scarcity. So I think that's always, a bit of a distorting force on these issues. People are trying to use the circumstances or the lack of clarity or the lack of data or the lack of regulation, to increase their own, standing and their own profits.
But heroes?
Heroes.
Can't hit heroes.
Yeah. So for heroes, I'm going to go really big picture. Peter Glick comes to mind, the founder of the Pacific Institute. And I guess in the same bucket, I'd put a lot of the sort of global scientists and researchers that I talked to. But, a scientist who has spent an enormous amount of effort and time and decades drawing attention to the issue of water scarcity. And I think we're talking about a lot of the sort of very granular and intricate and complex local details or even statewide details here. But the big picture is, this is a resource that, humans need to survive, and which is increasingly scarce around the world and is increasingly scarce in California and in Colorado. And, and it's people like Peter Glick who have brought a lot of attention to our overall dependence on, what's a diminishing resource, and tried to quantify that resource and tried to look hard and, bring a magnifying glass to the mechanisms, the regulations, the contradictions, some of the corruptions that we're talking about here today. And I think that's an enormous service.
That's great. Then Ian, and I'm going to ask this of both Ian and Lois, what upcoming decisions, and they might be federal decisions, tribal decisions, state decisions, private decisions, but things that are coming up in the future that are going to affect the farming in the West in the future? I mean, water is essential to farming, and farming is essential to many Western state economies. What decisions are coming that are going to impact farming going forward? Lois, I'll start with you.
Well, for my area, I think it's going to be Sigma, Sigma, Sigma. And you've got, I mean, Sigma's already in place and it has its own timeline, but DWR is coming out with comments probably at the end of this year on a number of the groundwater sustainability plans that have been put out there. And I know that a lot of the folks at the groundwater sustainability agencies, I'm trying not to use acronyms, are waiting with, quite a bit of trepidation to see what the first blush of comments are. And that will, I think, change how things are implemented. And I think that groundwater restrictions, as they are, and they will, roll out, it may take a few years, but they will change the face of farming substantially. And I don't know how, other than right now, it looks like small farmers are really being edged out. If you don't have enough acreage to fallow, say, 30% of your land and use that groundwater when you need to for either trading or for keeping the rest of your crops alive, it's hard to see how you're going to make it. So this could be a real big game changer locally in our valley.
Ian, what about you? For both California and Arizona, what decisions are going to make a huge difference in farming's future?
I really second what Lois said. I think that's so important in California in terms of how the groundwater sustainability plans will be implemented and what sorts of limitations will come and when. It seems like they're inevitable. And but the longer things sort of slide toward the real implementation deadline 2 decades out, the more will be lost in the meantime. And
what about Arizona? I'm asking you about Arizona because on the Colorado River last agreement, when a shortage is declared, and one was just declared in Lake Mead, Arizona takes it in the neck first, right? Arizona farmers.
Right. I think that will be very important as well. There is a widespread agreement in the Southwest and all along the Colorado River that the measures that have been taken so far are simply not enough, that more will need to be done to try to pare back the water use to something closer than what the river is actually delivering now. And it's a big gap. So how that's dealt with, I think, will be very important. And, also, we've done a lot of reporting in Arizona on the lack of regulation of groundwater in rural areas and how these areas have communities that have been running out of water as a result of just absolutely no restrictions on the groundwater pumping. And it's been talked about in the legislature. There have been proposals to change it so that there are some more controls, or so that local communities can have some say in managing their water. I see it as probably inevitable that at some point it will be done. Some sort of change needs to happen to manage water better in this really scarce environment, but I don't know when that might happen.
Okay, I've got just one more, and Abram, I think I'm going to head it in I'm going to send it in your direction. But as water gets scarcer, will new technology or will water trading efforts mitigate the impact? And what environmental justice questions occur with that? Who should regulate water trading?
If you'll let me jump to that in a second, I want to throw in my answer to the last question too, because it's different. And I don't mean to be cheeky about it, but the other thing that's going to affect the future of farming in the West is is the climate summit happening right now in Glasgow, is the decisions that U.S. Congress makes about the future of emissions in the United States, because the level of emissions globally is what's going to determine how fast and how dry the West gets. And the way that we grow crops in the most arid parts of this country is not going to be sustainable with the amount of water that we have now to work with across the states that we're talking about. And the rate of warming in the decades to come is going to determine how quickly those existing water supplies diminish even further. So really, I mean, that's kind of the top line for me. And I just wanted to throw that out there because I think that's the big picture. But to the question of privatization, I mean, it's really interesting, water trading. I mean, there's some, so the idea, with water trading and water rights, I think is that the efficiencies of capitalism can bring some order to the chaos of the water rights systems that we're talking about. And provide an incentive to not waste water and maximize its value. And then that value can be traded. And there's some inherent efficiencies with that. And I think that, in theory, in the textbooks, that's true. And it's been shown to work in certain situations like, the Palo Verde irrigation district in Southern California has been able to save water by selling fallowing crops for certain years and taking compensation in exchange for the water that they don't use. And, so the value of that water has made those sorts of trades possible. But the risk long-term, I can't get around being skeptical of what happens when you put scarce resources in the control of individual entities whose ultimate goal is to profit from them. And I think that we have a long history of seeing how that ends up more to the detriment of society than it does to the benefit. I did some reporting a couple of years back about big hedge funds that are involved in water trading in the Western United States, and and they're players in some of those deals. Like with Palo Verde irrigation district, but the bottom line is they have multiple $100 million funds, and those funds have promised a return to their investors, and their investors it might have an interest in the environment and in climate change and in water as a resource, but their first interest is in returns. And the more you take that water and attach a financial value to it and separate it from the land, by the way, buying land for its water rights, drying that land to remove that rights, you're ultimately going to exclude people who can't afford that water or whatever that scarce resource is in the future. And you're also making long-term decisions about the viability of land across, tens of millions of acres of the Western United States that might seem logical now or over the next couple of decades or something like that. But you're setting up a situation where, water won't be available to ever make some of those lands productive again in the future, at least to an average person that doesn't have the resources of a large corporation or an investment bank or private equity or things like that. So I think it's a very, very dangerous sort of road to go down.
Okay, I'm going to go to audience questions now. Yes, Lois.
I just want to jump in on what Abram said, because it's already happening. I'm working on a story right now out of Kings County where smaller farmers are like, they're priced out. They can't go beyond, and some are they're selling out like crazy because and it's a water thing. It's not necessarily just a land thing, but it's like if there's water with the land, they can't possibly come close to it. And there's no law in Kings County that prevents the groundwater from being shipped out as well. So it's not just surface water. It's already happening. So just for a fun fact.
Okay. We've got a lot of academics in this audience, and a couple of the questions that have come in from the audience are related to that. How do you interact with water researchers? I'm asking this of all three of you, but Ian, I'll let you start off. How do you interact with water researchers? What are valuable interactions and what just frustrate you? And what most useful role could academics play in improving the public understanding of water problems and solutions? Ian, over to you.
I can't think of anything particularly frustrating. I just really appreciate the time that water researchers take to tell me about their work, whether that's related to climate science or water management. I just really appreciate it. And I often find that informal conversations when I'm not working on a story are especially helpful in understanding what they're working on and the details of how our water system comes together.
And then another question, this is somebody who knows about how news organizations work. In terms of the support you get from your organizations, how does the water beat fare in competition for media attention and resources, given that there's such a decline in local coverage and regional coverage nationwide? Abram or Lois? Lois, go for it.
That's why I started SJV Water. I covered water as much as I could as a columnist at the Bakersfield Californian, but I did receive on my review one time during the last drought too much water coverage. So I kind of was like, it's kind of an epic drought. The river is drier than, from the time Jesus walked the earth. I don't, I think it's kind of a big story. But it is a tough beat when it's speaking for newspapers. When you don't have enough people to cover, just the basics of education and the city council meeting and all that kind of stuff, it's hard to say, oh, let me, work for a month and a half on this really complex story and bring it to you. So I understand the reason, but that's why I started SJV Water, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, the more the better. It's so great that you're doing that.
Yeah, I agree. It is wonderful that you're doing that. Abram, I'm going to turn this audience question to you. You've been covering water in the West for a long time. Have you noticed any progress during one administration, in state government administrations, from one to the next, or from one federal administration to the next? Is there any progress?
The California, the Sagama Act is progress. It's too bad that it's going to take decades to implement and bring to full force. But but that's an example of the the kind of work that needs to be done. You see progress in the interstate negotiations over the Colorado River, in the sense that that there's been a willingness to come to the table and to recognize at least the nature, the character of the predicament that they're in, and for most of those parties to concede something. For Arizona, to be willing to accept its shortages first, for example. But big picture, unfortunately, I think that I see, the various tiers of government grinding a little bit too slowly, on this issue. And I bring it back again to the Colorado River, and the shortage declarations. And while there's been, decades of negotiations over how to share those shortage declarations, and now there's a roadmap for, for what each state will accept as as water becomes more scarce. No one's ever really sort of fundamentally considered the basic, over allocation of that river, or looked honestly, I think, at the long-term trajectory, for that river, which supplies water for 40 million people. So, we're on pace the river basin's on pace to outpace all of the shortage projections very quickly. By 2023, the federal government's estimating, that Colorado River levels in the big reservoirs will exceed some of the most dire projections in those shortage declarations. So the federal government hasn't been able to remedy that. None of those 7 states have been able to remedy it. California has been talking about water scarcity for about 100 years and hasn't fundamentally changed that dynamic either. I guess I'd give it low marks over the long term.
Okay, I'll cut. And Abram, I'm going to stick with you for one. There's one other very specific Colorado question. The Colorado River Management Guidelines expire in 2026. What do you foresee the outcome as being the outcome of the new negotiations? And will that fundamentally change the way water is distributed in the West?
I confess to not being super familiar with that particular expiration. Long term, the big picture, I think that's going to shift as the Colorado River situation becomes more dire, is there's going to be increasing pressure on California more than anything. Or the real sort of powerhouse in that dynamic, take an extraordinary amount of water from the Colorado River, have been slow to give up the rights and to even negotiate, in a very flexible manner, for those rights. And so, as everybody else's hands are increasingly tied in that river basin, there's going to be more and more pressure on California. The fear among people that I talk to is that if you can't negotiate those agreements, then those conversations get more and more acrimonious. They can wind up in outright conflict. You're going to see more, sort of battles heading to, we're back to that word adjudication, back to the Supreme Court. you know, and who knows from there. I mean, my personal feeling looking at this dynamic is that you'll have to see some really fundamental changes in the way water is used across the West for that situation to resolve.
And as we're getting closer to the end of our hour, there's a question that I'd love all your answers to, and then I'll answer it too, which is, what book is essential reading on water in the West? And if you guys don't mention what I would answer, I'll mention it. But Lois, I'll start with you. What book is essential reading? If you're busy and you only have time for one.
Well, and this is a big one, but I would say The Dreamt Land by Mark Arax. I love it, and it is very California centric, but it's first of all incredibly well written. I mean, he's just lyrical. I've tried to emulate his prose and just end up crashing and burning terribly, embarrassingly. But when I was reading it, of course, I was like, oh my God, this, because he's writing about the history of water in California, but it's like, it just could be happening real time. So to Abram's point, yes, California has been talking about these same things for 100 years. But I love that book. I have it dog-eared, so I love it.
Ian?
Yeah, I totally agree. Mark Arax, an amazing book. I would have to say, although, you know, it is a little dated, but I think still very timely, is Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner.
Yeah, it's Cadillac Desert has its essential reading. That was,
if none of you mentioned that book, that's what I was going to say. I was just on a cross-country trip and doing some, books on tape listening in the middle of the highways. And Cadillac Desert, from the descriptions of Powell's trip down the Colorado to the descriptions of the way the natives in the Dakotas were messed over by the Bureau of Reclamation, it's just the detail in that. And he may not be as lyrical as Arax, but it's a heck of a book. And I would go on with that. If we have one more minute, since we have, wait a minute, we may have one more minute. How do you choose stories? What are the trigger points that get you interested in a story? Lois?
I'm such a terrible reporter. I almost always think, oh, this is going to be an awful story, and it's going to be such a pain. And I make a phone call and I start talking to people. It always turns out to be a really good story. So I choose stories by, I don't know, making phone calls and just talking to people. I do want to. I saw somebody had a question about access from government. And I don't know if everybody else is running into this, but I'm starting to run into this right now. And that is that water districts are moving water around all the time in these different deals. And now they've gotten to the point where when I start asking for invoices and stuff like that, oh, well, that was a private deal between landowners, which really something needs to be done about that, because, really this is state water potentially or other water, and it's being moved in a public conveyance through public agencies. And I think that should all be public information, that they're getting away without hiding water movement by saying it's private, and that just honks me off. Anyway.
Thanks. And Ian, in 15 seconds, what gets you into a story?
Well, I'm just constantly in a process of, I think, prioritization, figuring out what absolutely must get done, and just prioritizing. And sometimes I don't know that there's any particular formula for it. I am just reading a lot and talking to people and thinking about what I really need to get out there.
Abram, you've got 15 seconds. What gets you into a story?
Yeah, it's a combination of what's been said. So what's most interesting and feels like it's important to say, and also my work is aimed at some form of accountability. So what are the wrongs that need to be righted or at least spotlighted?
Thank you all so much. This has just been fascinating and actually a little fun too. It was. It also brings me back to all the stories that I haven't done and need to do. Abram, Ian, Lois, it was great of you to take this hour and tell us so much that none of us knew about what goes on with this crazy business of covering water. And Felicia and the Water in the West program, thank you for making sure that all of this happened. I really appreciate it. I'm going to sign off now and let the technicians take care of things. To the audience, thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hey guys, that was great. That was really great.
I vote for fascinating and absurd, which what Abram said as the title of something next time with water.
That'd be great.
Fascinating and absurd is so in it.